a journalist, teaches African history at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, a broadcaster with WBAI in New York. He holds degrees in journalism from Columbia University, economics from Syracuse University. His book, Manufacturing Hate: How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media, is actually what inspired this particular program, African News Review. He's an explorer. He has discovered so many beautiful sites in Europe. He has even given a name to London's main river, River Gulu. And
Yes.
he's none other than Comrade Milton Allimadi.
Thank
Welcome
you.
back.
Thank you, sir. Thank you as always.
Thank you. Yes, this week has been, as usual, a news filled week. First, we had obviously in the United States, you guys are marking Juneteenth. And
Right.
for those who are not familiar with the idea of what Juneteenth is outside of the United States, do you mind just giving us a brief overview of what it entails?
Well, it's celebrated on June 19th,
Okay.
and historically, after slavery was abolished in the United States, uh, there were parts of Texas that did not get the news until much later. So parts of Texas started commemorating that
Mm,
after those locations ultimately got the news that slavery had actually been abolished.
okay.
We're talking 1865. So obviously, we did not have the benefit of social media at that time. And obviously, our people were not encouraged to be informed at that
Mm,
time.
mm,
So this is rather a recent national holiday, but
okay.
I'm glad that it's been adopted as a national holiday in the
Okay.
United States that commemorates enslavement. But of course, with me, um, I don't think the commemoration of enslavement can be ever complete without combining it with reparations for enslavement.
Mm,
So
mm,
that should be the ultimate goal of Juneteenth, in my view.
okay. Yeah, thank you for that. And also another date uh, that also went by in the same week was June 16, 1976, the Soweto Massacre. Some will call it the uprising, but it was actually the massacre that made it much more um, resonate in the memories of Pan Africanists and South Africans as well. And again, could you give us a brief overview of what June 16, 1976
Well,
is?
absolutely. That is when the the youth of South Africa went to the streets. And part of it was, of course, triggered by the apartheid racist regime's attempt to impose Africana, the language of Africana, Afrikaans, of the Dutch settlers, the Dutch colonialists, as the language of instruction,
Mm,
even in the schools. And obviously, the youth who were very conscious by that time and saw this as another form of cultural and linguistic imperialism, in addition to the oppression they were already enduring. So they went out to the streets, and the regime reacted brutally and committed the massacre. And actually, that was also the beginning of the end for the regime
mm,
because it was already under tremendous pressure. And of course, it just escalated the global condemnation and isolation of South Africa after that massacre. So, yes, uh, we, uh, remember all those young people who sacrificed their lives, and may they rest in peace with the ancestors.
yes, rest in peace. Yes, and which gives us a beautiful segue to the first story of the day, which is the story coming out of South Africa that a coalition government has been formed. And interesting, it says, the headline, we go to the Financial Times for the first story of the day. And it says South Africa DA signs power sharing deal with the ANC. Not the other way around. Voluntary national. That's, I
Yes,
mean, when I was
I'm glad
reading it,
you.
that's the first thing that jumped out at me.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm glad you caught it quickly, and I hope that our comrades who join us on a weekly basis also start catching something like that very quickly, and that really tells you the entire story right there.
Okay. So it gets interesting. It gets more interesting, rather. So we've got the voluntary national unity government. We allow Cyril Ramaphosa to remain in power. Okay. The lead is South Africa's ruling National Congress has signed a landmark power sharing deal with the Democratic Alliance, paving the way for a new government to be formed under the leadership of ANC Cyril Ramaphosa, who happens to be the president of South Africa. Such a deal was vital to allowing the ANC, which lost its majority for the first time since the end of white minority rule 30 years ago in the May election, to remain in power with a working majority. And okay, the 9 page, there was a series of agreement, discussions, and uh, meetings which culminated in a 9 page document which commits the party to cooperate through a voluntary government of national unity. Significantly, however, Julius Malewa's economic freedom fighters and Jacob Zuma's Umkhonto Sigwe, both radical parties that promote nationalization of banks and important industries, are not part of the pact. It gets more interesting. Signed by the ANC Secretary General Fikile Umbalula and DA's chairman Heli Zille, the document lays out the mechanics for coalition rule, from how cabinets will be constituted to guidelines for policy and dispute resolution. Zille told the Financial Times that this was a significant development for the country. This gives, in quotes, South Africa a chance of creating a stable democracy and an inclusive economy, she said. The document stipulates while the president retains the power to appoint his cabinet, this should be done in consultation with the leaders of the respective parties. Now, there is another part here. Okay, yeah. The leader of the DA, John Steenhuisen, told reporters the deal was a historical movement for the country which will allow his party to now co-govern. He said, and I quote, the EFF and the MK do not share the constitutional principles that will ensure the country progressed. He said if the ANC had chosen to go into partnership with those two, the DA would not have joined the government. Yes. A lot
Well,
to.
yeah, I mean, it speaks to where Africa is today
Hmm,
since Ghana won its independence in 1957.
correct.
It is a sad testament to how we have retrogressed and gone backward. This is, of course, a backward march, even though the Financial Times refers to the Democratic Alliance, the DA, as quote unquote liberal. That, of course, is nonsense. This is the most radical of all the parties. Why is it radical? Because it basically it's preaching the Bible of apartheid.
Hmm,
It opposes any land reform in a country where 80%, the black majority, own 4%. In a country where the Europeans, who make up 7.3% of the population, own 72%. In a country where unemployment of black people is 37%, while that of European South Africans is only 7.4%. And they are saying this is what represents, quote, stability and democracy. In fact, it represents the opposite, because this is what apartheid was all about, to exclude the majority population, not only from political power, but from the benefits of the economic prosperity, from the wealth of South Africa. So we have an alliance now between the party that led the struggle for national liberation, the African National Congress, going back in bed with the party of apartheid. And of course, it's historic. It's historic in the sense that South Africa, at least for the time being, has surrendered the march toward independence and decolonization and has taken several steps backward. And also, it is significant that the other minor party that is included in this alliance, the Inkatha Freedom Party,
Yep.
was once also in bed with the apartheid regime. As you remember, the late Buthelezi, Gatsha Buthelezi, who was the leader of that party for a long time, often betrayed the national liberation struggle and worked in cahoots with the apartheid regime. After Mandela was released in 1990 up to 1994, who was instigating the instability in South Africa?
It was
to
him.
discourage the elections in 1994. That was to include and eventually included all the ethnic groups in South Africa and nationalities. It was the National Party of Apartheid in cahoots with Inkatha. They were instigating violence between supporters of the African National Congress and Inkatha Party to give the impression to the global community that Africans will not be able to run the state. So now you look, they're all on the same side now. The ANC, the DA, which of course is just a new form of the National Party, and the Inkatha Freedom Party. So I submit that this is not stable at all. In fact, it's a very dangerous government because it means that they want to exclude the conversation of how to redistribute the national wealth and to really bring some of the prosperity to the underserved and exploited, economically exploited majority population of Africans in South Africa. And of course, it should not be surprising that the Financial Times would celebrate this, just like the Economist magazine was celebrating this, and the New York Times was also celebrating this. So it's no surprise there.
Can I just also add this last part?
Yes.
The investors said they preferred a deal between the ANC and the pro-market DA, believing it will ensure stable policy and potentially accelerate the economic growth. The rand, which had weakened to touch 19 rands to the dollar in recent days amid fears of a coalition between the ANC and leftist EFF, strengthened after the news of a deal with the DA to around 18.33.
Okay, so here's the irony of all of this. Number one, what was colonialism all about? It was about you not being in control of your production and your sovereignty and your government. So the Financial Times is telling us that it is investors and how the comfort level of investors that should determine the government of South Africa, number one. Number two, here's the biggest irony of all that is not mentioned in this article. The irony is that in these Western countries, right, in the United States, in Britain, other parts of Western Europe, there is tremendous pressure against the state. In fact, most of these countries have a leftward leaning push, particularly by the younger generation, right? So in your own country, you're dealing with the pressure that's been created by the accumulation of wealth within a small percentage of the very rich elite in these countries. You're dealing with that pressure. And yet you're celebrating that this pressure of accumulation just within a small minority should continue in other parts of the world, including South Africa. It's utter nonsense, of course.
So finally, what in terms of because I noticed you wrote an op-ed on your Facebook wall with regards to the situation. What would be your overriding takeaway from the entire coalition government arrangement?
My takeaway is that this is a transition, a transitory measure.
Okay.
It will not survive. I will not be surprised if it collapses much sooner than many people anticipate.
Okay.
The pressures are tremendous. You cannot have 37% Black unemployment. You cannot have 80% of the population in control of 4% of the land. It's preposterous. And that's part of the irony. You would hope that the European South African population would have much more enlightened leadership who come up and say, we've had a very good long run of centuries. Yep. We cannot continue to subjugate the majority of population economically. They did not, as Cabral said, Amilcar Cabral, that people support the national liberation struggle, not for some ideological issues. They want better standard of living for themselves and their family. If it applied in Guinea-Bissau, it applies in South Africa.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Speaking of application all over the world, basic values, basic tenets. We're talking leadership now, and we go to Rwanda. Rwanda is due to have its election the end of July, and a female opposition presidential candidate has been barred from running, and which makes a mockery of the entire situation in the sense that we're being told that Rwanda is so this story comes from The Guardian, the UK Guardian, and it's titled Rwanda opposition leader barred from standing against president. The lead is Diana Rigawara, named missing from list of candidates to challenge Paul Kagame in 15 July vote. According to The Guardian, a prominent opponent of the Rwandan president, Paul Kagame, has been barred from standing in next month's election to challenge his 3-decade rule. Dana Rigwara, the leader of the People's Salvation Movement, who was also barred in 2017, launched her election bid in May and submitted her candidacy last week. Her name was missing from the provisional list of candidates announced by the Electoral Commission on Thursday. After all the time, the work and efforts I put in, I am very disappointed to hear I'm not on the list of presidential candidates, Rigwara had said on X. Paul Kagame, why won't you let me run? She asked. The Election Commission said she failed to provide a criminal record statement as required, and that she had not met the threshold of 600 supporting signatures from citizens. Rugwara was also barred from the 2017 race over accusations she had forged supporters' signature for her application. She was arrested and charged with forgery and inciting insurrection and held behind bars for more than a year. Rugwara is the daughter of Asinama Paul Rugwara, an industrialist and former significant donor to Kagame's ruling Rwanda Patriotic Front Party before it fell out with the leader. Do you see a pattern?
Yes.
So what do you make of it?
Well, I thought you were going to read a little more. There's a part that just shows you how
I know the part. I know the part you were waiting for. In the run-up to the vote, Rwandan courts have also rejected appeals from prominent opposition figure Bernard Ntanga Victoria Ingabire to remove the previous conditions in effect, barring them from standing. There was a part here. Yeah. Kagame's de facto ruler since 1994 genocide and president since 2000. He has won 3 elections with more than 90% of the vote and is widely expected to be victorious again in July. He has been praised for putting the country on the path of economic transformation after the genocide, but he faces frequent criticism over rights abuses and intolerance of the opposition. Right.
So here's the saddest part. If listeners have good memories and they just listen to what you just read right now, they will realize that they heard this exact verbatim. And that is the corruption in corporate Western media.
Mm.
And I want listeners who are listening now to try to, jog their memory and say to themselves, where did they read this before? Could you read it one more time for the listeners, starting about when he won the election or something, that nonsense, that part?
Oh, okay. Bear me a second. Let's go back there. Okay, so Kagame's de facto ruler since 1994 genocide and president since 2000. He has won 3 elections with more than 90% of the vote and is widely expected to be victorious again in July.
Okay, stop at that point. So listeners, I'm going to give you an exercise. Please highlight what Brother Adesoji just read right now, or write it down again, and then go to the URL and put it on your URL, and then put the New York Times. And you will discover this exact same quote, word for word. It's really disgusting how they keep lifting this from one article to the next and keep spreading the same nonsensical propaganda. Where in the world does anybody win elections by 90+%? Obviously it happened in the former Soviet Union, with Brezhnev, Andropov, and all those guys.
And that was
because
a one-party
they rigged
state.
those elections. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So now you, the Guardian of all the publications, the Guardian is one that we have semi-respect for. You're going to just print that without saying that this is inconceivable. You're not even mentioning the word rigging. I'm very disappointed on this occasion with the Guardian. And I might actually follow up with a tweet. Absolutely. We don't expect this from the Guardian, because if we can't rely on the Guardian, Al Jazeera, and a few other outlets, then who do you rely on? So even much more than Kagame, forget Kagame. Obviously, we know he's going to rig the vote. I think the most interesting thing in this article was the surrender by the Guardian itself. And I can understand perhaps why. Of course, I don't accept it. I reject it. They remember how Kagame retaliated against the BBC when the BBC produced that documentary, Rwanda's Untold Story, which people can watch on Venmo. And the BBC was banned from covering from Rwanda for a couple of years. So perhaps the Guardian is afraid of a similar retaliation. And so that's why they're basically printing a press release. That's what that was. That's a press release, It's a big shame.
Oh, so
yeah, you may as well call it the Kagame Guardian,
Well, that's the interesting thing about studying the Western media. And if you're getting value from watching this, please
I'll tell you even a funnier story.
Go on.
In Uganda, the correspondent or the stringer, the freelancer, I don't know if he's on staff, for Reuters news agency. He comes, I think, from the same part of the country where dictator General Yoweri Museveni comes from.
Okay.
So I was reading a couple of his articles carefully, and there are parts that he lifts verbatim from one article to the other. So in a span of a couple of months, he may have 5 or 6 articles, and he keeps lifting that passage, right? And that passage is very similar to the one about the Guardian that is speaking about Kagame right now.
Yeah,
they say, he's won, 5 elections, and he's credited with restoring peace and stability to Uganda, and that and for that reason, he's popular. You know, it's utter nonsense, of course, because the opposite is true. Bobby Wine is 10 times more popular than Yoweri Museveni. So, but here's the best thing about this Reuters writer in Uganda. There were typos, right? He misspelled in his praise of Museveni, there are parts that he misspelled a couple of words.
Okay.
So you can go through the 5, 6, 7, or 8 different articles, and that same misspelling is still there. So that was 100% proof that he was just copying and pasting and migrating it to his next article. Copying and pasting, migrating it to the next article. So I took a screenshot of 3 different dates, maybe even years of his article, and I tweeted it. And I said, I caught you. You just copy and paste. Basically, you're not a reporter, you're a liar. And I copied his managing editor as well. So the message is, people, we can fight back. We can fight back against these corporate media liars, you know.
And speaking of fighting back, this is why we have the African News Review. And so if you find value, please subscribe, share, and like, you know, because like I said earlier in my introduction, the reason why we actually started this program was because of the good comrades book, How Africa is Demonized in the Western Media. And please get this book, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. It gives you...
And if there's a UK or European publisher that is listening, please get in touch with me via mallimadi@gmail.com. That's mallimadi@gmail.com, because my own publisher is suppressing my book in the United States.
Can you imagine
So
that?
if I get an international publisher, I will buy back my copyright so I can make this book available. We cannot allow this type of censorship. How can your own publish? It reminds me of, remember where the great artist Prince was once fighting with his own
music.
record label?
Yeah.
You know, and at that time I didn't understand that, you know, that well. But now, obviously, I'm not comparing myself to Prince, but I'm saying the principle whereby your own publisher does not want to sell your books. Can you believe that? Here's the deal. When I had an earlier version of the book, you know, The Hearts of Darkness, this version is much better edited, more chapters, and more information, right? But when I had the earlier version, which was self-published, I would go to speak at locations with 100 copies. I would come out with 0 copies. If I went with 50, I would come out with 0 copies. I would go to places where people would complain that I did not bring enough books.
Copies, yeah.
So in the beginning, when the book was published, my publisher, as I said before, is giving me a decent royalty check. So I know he's doing well. So I sent him a proposal. I said, listen, let's go to leading Black organizations and let them host book signings and bring 100 or 200 copies of the book. Any copy that is not sold, not only will I say, wait for my royalty check and take a cut. I said, no, I would buy it on the spot. I would buy it from my own collection, you know? My publisher did not even respond to that proposal. Just think about that.
There must be something in that same book
that
it's
yes, I think somebody, I'm just speculating, but somebody might have pointed out that, do you know what this book is talking about?
Well, I mean, the fact that the book focuses on one major news organization.
Yes.
And I won't spoil it for the viewers.
I
think
that is precisely the reason, right?
Yeah. So I'll allow you get the book first, and then you make. And speaking of uncomfortable truths, apparently the FBI Director Christopher Wray has been in Africa and
Right.
has been spreading the gospel as they speak. Okay,
Right.
so the story goes that I'll share. It's FBI, and this comes from the New York Times.
Right.
So FBI director makes rare visit to Africa as terrorism threat grows. The Islamic State and Al Qaeda considers Africa a very fertile ground, says Christopher A. Wray, who is meeting
Right.
with officials in Nigeria and Kenya. Oh, the story goes. He met with officials in Kenya and Nigeria, repeated his warning that the United States and its allies worldwide are operating in a heightened threat environment that has been energized by the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. The main reason for my visit to both countries was to raise awareness about the threat on the continent that has serious implications for the United States homeland, but that does not get the attention they deserve, Mr. Wray says in a telephone interview from Nigeria on Friday. For several years now, a group like ISIS, like Al Qaeda, has considered Africa a very fertile ground. And then he goes into whatever. Somalia has, I'm not even going to read that. At the same time, groups in West Africa has declared allegiance to Al Qaeda and the Islamic States are on the march. Military coups, and this is the key part. Military coups have toppled civilian-led governments in Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The new leaders have ordered US and French troops to leave, and in some cases invited Russian mercenaries to take their place. What say you?
Okay. Okay. So that article, obviously, it's a complete, nonsense. Because first of all, it's very sad. But I hope that in the course of our analysis and critique, our viewers become better at understanding what is being said in corporate media. And of course, the biggest lesson is that what is being written is not what is actually the story.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Often it is a mask for the story. So I believe there's a part toward the end referring to the reason as to why some of these groups, armed groups, are attracting supporters.
Okay,
right?
So yes. So this is the part here. At the same time, groups have declared their support. Obviously, as a result, where is it? Yes. The discussion in Kenya and Nigeria between US and African officials, Mr. Wray, centered on overlapping interests and ways to fight the common threats. Countering threats posed by groups like Al-Shabaab is certainly more than one agency or one government can tackle. The first by an FBI agent reflects the White House determination to deepen relations with East African nations, even as other countries, including Russia and China, are racing to do the same. That's the part you wanted.
Okay. No, there's another part that refers to social issues. And that is the reason why they're attracted to these organizations.
When you look at the region, the West African region more broadly, we remain concerned about instability and how they could have an impact on terrorist groups' ability to exploit that situation, said Mr. Wray.
Precisely. And I think further down, even in that same section, it refers to social issues.
Beyond the threat to Westerners and other interests in Africa, we are vigilant to the possibility their plans and intentions can shift at any point. So while, yes, there are foreign threats, people in the United States should think of them as issues that are shouldn't think of them as an issues that are world away.
Right. So basically, what the article does is burying the lead, right? And the story should have been, but then it would defeat the whole purpose of the visit.
Yes.
Of the FBI director.
Yeah.
Because the story is actually
this is what we want you to do.
The collapse of their economies, right?
Yep.
the collapse of the economies, the neglect by the governments because they're not able to survive, to provide. And that is the reason why young people are joining these armed groups. But then, if that is the case, then an alert reader would say, wait, so if that is the problem, is that something that the FBI director can address? Or is that an issue better discussed with the president of the World Bank and the managing director of the IMF and the executive director of the World Trade Organization? Should not be the discussion? So instead of doing that story, we go around about to justify hundreds of words about the visit by the FBI guy, when we know that the visit is to co-opt the intelligence services in Nigeria and in Kenya, and to work closely with the FBI. But you cannot write it that way, because the citizens in Kenya and in Nigeria would be outraged. They would say, wait a minute, this is colonialism. Why are you doing this? Why are you basically setting us up as branches of the FBI? In fact, they tell you explicitly.
States. Yeah.
They tell you explicitly. They say in Kenya, they set up a similar type of task force. It's in the article, but the way it's written, you might miss it. But they're telling you, read very carefully, they're telling you that we're coming here. This is why the director is coming here. They told you that the Kenyan president was recently at the White House for a state dinner. And so you can translate it, the article very, very, very easily. The Kenyan president, Ruto, came to the White House. He was feted by President Biden. He was given a state dinner. And after that, he agreed to basically allow Kenya's intelligence services to become a branch of the FBI, and so on and so forth. I'm not so familiar with how it occurred in the case of Nigeria, but it would translate to the same thing I just said about Kenya. But obviously, you cannot write an article like that, because it would generate a lot of outrage.
And yes, the fallout of his visit is still reverberating across the.
And then there's another part that you read. And please, listeners, always, when you're reading these Western media, when you're listening, whether it's on a podcast, whether it's on BBC radio, whether it's on TV, listen very carefully so that you are not deceived. So we are told that military coups led to toppling civilian-led governments.
Governments, yeah.
Instead of what? Instead of democratic governance.
Governance, yeah.
Because now they're realizing that way, it's really hard to sell that lie. Just because they're a civilian or dressed in suits, it did not mean they were democratic at all. So if they're not democratic, what really is the difference between them and the military? As Walter Rodney once said, we tend to tolerate authoritarianism in our African countries and politics. Authoritarianism by civilians. But when it comes to authoritarianism, who is better at it? Is it not the military?
Yeah, because of the direct chain of command. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So obviously, they write civilian-led governments to deceive you into translating that into democratic governments. But they're not really deceiving you. They're deceiving you by omission. They're allowing you to deceive yourself. You see? So listen, okay, why did they not say democratic? Because they know many of those governments, where the leadership could wear suits and ties, but they are authoritarian.
I mean, we've just talked about one, Kagame.
Absolutely. You see?
Is a civilian, but is he democratic?
Right. He's a civilian technically, but in essence, he's a military general.
Yoweri Museveni.
Same thing.
Democratic. So,
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very easy. Once you've deconstructed about 10 of their corporate media spins, then it becomes a template to deconstruct everything. And I wish we had a class in deconstructing Western propaganda in all of our schools in Africa, because we would end up producing better citizens and better leaders, because the leadership comes from the citizens.
Much more informed citizenry. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And speaking of leadership and neocolonial pushes, the foreign minister for Benin Republic has recently come out to say the charter creating the ECOWAS should be looked at in order to avoid interference in internal politics, following on from what transpired late last year with Niger Republic. And so I would go to his take. Yes, again, it comes from the Money paper. And there's a reason why I actually pick it, but I'll allow you state your point first, then I'll tell you why I actually picked the story from the Financial Times. It says, keep ECOWAS out of internal regional politics. Beninois minister says, West African bloc urged to focus on economy and avoid meddling in Western states' domestic affairs. The lead says West Africa's main economic club should focus on economic integration and the fight against poverty and terrorism, and steer clear of interfering in internal politics of member states. Benin's foreign minister has said. Segun Ajadi Bakare told the Financial Times that the economic community of West African states should be reformed, that reaching agreement on how to respond to political crisis was paramount. Nobody can say we can keep ECOWAS as it is, said Bakare, a former Societe Generale executive who was appointed foreign minister last year. The bloc's members should sit down together to find a new consensus when it comes to internal politics, although Benin believes it should not interfere. ECOWAS has responded haphazardly to the takeovers, which began when soldiers ousted elected Malian leader Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta in August 2020. The country experienced a second coup 9 months later. Guinea's push came in September 21, while Burkina Faso experienced 2 coups in 2022. But following international criticism that it's been too lenient, the bloc imposed sweeping sanctions on Niger after the head of the country's presidential guard deposed and detained President Mohamed Bazoum last July, threatening to invade if he was not released. The threat was not realized, and the ruling junta remains in power while Bazoum remains in detention, although Bakary said work was ongoing to secure his freedom. The minister urged ECOWAS needed to change its approach given its lack of success in restoring democracy in the coup-hit country. The junta in Burkina Faso recently extended its term by another 5 years. But there's a part here. Yes. Okay. In Mali, we set a transitional table. 4 years later, is there a solution? No. In Guinea and Burkina Faso, we did the same thing and no solution. Bakary said, with Niger, we decided to put sanctions in place. We received a very big backlash and there was no result. We've had to ask ourselves at some point if our methodology is the right one. Where is it? But there's something here with regards to money. Yes. Yeah, this is it. Benin and Niger are now embroiled in a spat over the latter's refusal to open its side of the shared border despite the end of the sanctions, with Niamey citing security concerns. The impasse is hampering Niger's own exports of its oil through a new 2,000-kilometer pipeline from the landlocked countries to the port of Seme in Benin. republic. Yes. What's your assessment? Before I say why I picked the story.
Okay. So, there are many elements in this article. And of course, as a Pan-African, I disagree with the foreign minister in the sense that I actually support interference.
Okay.
Because we're celebrating artificial sovereignties that were created as a result of European imperialism and colonialism. They drew these artificial boundaries that have separated us and held back our vitality and our ability to actually grow politically and economically. And I think, as I said in our previous discussion, we are in a position that China was in the earlier parts of the 20th century, right? Mm-hmm. When China was still basically a collection of warlords in different parts of the country. Even after Chiang Kai-shek came into power, China was still beholden to the West. It was only after the Chinese Revolution. So we need to have a United States of Africa. Really, that's the only way we can survive. And if it involves interference in the so-called internal affairs of these artificial countries, so be it. I like what is going on in the sense that Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger in the last several months have made many joint declarations and taken many joint positions. And that is the reason why ECOWAS was not able to invade Niger to reverse the coup, because whether it was realistic or not, Burkina Faso, together with Mali, declared that they had a joint pact, and any invasion of any one of those countries would be seen as an invasion of all those three countries. And of course, that made a difference. And that was the reason why they did not invade. And then, of course, they saw the level of popular support from the ground. The ECOWAS other member country leaders, including that of Nigeria, saw the popular support that the regime, the military regime, had on the ground, mass support. And that also deterred them. Of course, they failed to reverse the coup, and they don't want Mali, Burkina, and Niger to leave ECOWAS, as it is a process. They've declared that they want to leave. I think once you make the declaration, it goes through a 12-month period. Yeah. So the rest of ECOWAS is determined that in the next, before the expiration of that 12-month period, they will convince these three countries not to leave. And then, of course, he has a very self-centered interest for his own country. When you mentioned that part about the oil pipeline, because if Niger is not exporting its oil, it means that Benin will not be making the revenues as well. So those are the interesting parts of this element. But then, of course, there's also a very glaring omission, and I hope that viewers and listeners caught that. The article talked about a series of coups, and the coups are projected in a negative way, right? There are bad things, these coups, Mali, and then Burkina, and then you have Niger. I hope that the perceptive listeners were able to see that two coups were not mentioned. And that was the one in Chad, which of course was supported, endorsed, and engineered by France, and the one in Gabon as well. See, our people, please don't be deceived. Everything they said was truthful. Yes, it's a fact. There was a coup in Mali. There was a coup in Burkina. There was a coup in Niger. So if you're just too relaxed and you're not listening carefully, you would forget that they did not mention Chad and Gabon. Because those are the coups that they helped engineer and they support because it maintain essentially rulership from the same family that they want to continue to maintain in power. Do not be deceived. Please read carefully.
Okay, so you caught one. The other one was the fact that here was a guy who was previously a guy as a chief executive with a
Yes,
bank,
yes, of course.
talking to the
Yes,
Financial Times
yes.
about money
He's one of
opportunities.
them. He's one of them.
Exactly. About money opportunities that he's been taken off the table. I was like, talk about having a conversation in public. He was. I was like,
he's their man.
Yeah.
You know, as the Financial Times would say, investors would be happy.
We'll be happy. So when he said, when I was reading, I was like, okay. Then
you read the guy's resume. You said,
listen, I was okay. Why are you talking to the Financial Times though? You're the foreign minister. Why are you talking to the Financial Times?
Oh no, that's exactly how they love it. They want the person who, like in Cote d'Ivoire, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do they have in Cote d'Ivoire? In Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast.
Yeah.
They said Gbagbo was a dictator who tried to extend his term illegally and did not even win the election, right? So they helped install Qatar with a military intervention by the French. Right. And they took Gbagbo to the International Criminal Court. He served some time. Later on, the conviction, of course, was vacated and he was released, right?
Yep.
So what does Ouattara do? His 2 terms expires and he extends his term and he's not condemned. There's no military intervention by the French.
No.
And he's endorsed. We must be wary of these double standards in the interest of Western imperialism, And we must always be able to connect the dots. Don't see any African country in isolation. Look at how other countries are covered as well and connect the dots. That is part of our process of seeing all these African countries as one.
And one of the key tools is the use of media, because if they can get the news article,
of course, it's always been the use of media. I told you about the editorial in the New York Times in 1876, which made the argument that Africans were being tortured because they had some human sensibility, right? But they were affiliated with the ancient crocodile and hippopotamus. I don't know what that means. But on the other hand, they had some human tendencies as well. So that's why they're very tortured, right? So Britain should go and colonize. So the newspaper, the media rather, has always historically been used to justify our exploitation. And then, of course, after colonialism, look, they cannot run these modern states. We need to intervene and go back. So it justified, first of all, it justified slavery, right? Where Africans were projected as basically animals. So it's sanitized. They're being confined to plantation. It's sanitized. They're being shipped like rats on those boats, and millions dying along the way, and Europeans not being appalled and saying, why are you doing this to fellow human beings? Because the media had been effective in conditioning the European mind that these were not really human beings like us. So it was used during slavery, during colonialism, and in our contemporary era, the era of neocolonialism. It's not as outright brutal as it was. It's become much more refined, and that is why we have to really pay attention when we listen and read very carefully.
In between the lines, yes. Read
Absolutely.
in between the lines. Read in between the lines. And speaking of lines, the Ugandan oil pipeline again is in the
Right.
news, and this time is due to the attack on the leader of an NGO who was beaten, abducted, and taken far away from his place, dumped. And let's just go ahead and share the story. And it goes thus, and it comes from The Guardian. It's a Ugandan oil pipeline protester beaten as part of alarming crackdown. Stephen Kizikiriza is one of the 11 campaigners against ECOWAS targeted by authorities in the past 2 weeks, rights group says. A man campaigning against the controversial 5 billion or 4 billion pounds East African crude oil pipeline, commonly known as ECOWAS, is recovering in hospital after an alleged beating by the Ugandan armed forces in the latest incident in what has been called an alarming crackdown on the country's environmentalists. Stephen Kirikiza, who works for Ugandan Environmental Governance Institute, EGI, a non-profit organization, was abducted in Kampala on 4th of June, according to his employer. He was beaten, questioned, and then abandoned hundreds of miles from the capital on Sunday evening. The Ugandan People Defense Force denied it was responsible and accused Kirikiza of faking his abduction. Colonel Dio Akiki, the military deputy spokesman, said it has been established that the said person is totally deceiving. All the facts has been established. We're in touch with the police and his organization to know his intention for telling such lies. End quote. According to the International Federation for Human Rights, Kirikiza is one of 11 campaigners against oil projects which has been targeted by Ugandan police, military, and government officials in the past 2 weeks. The ECOWAS plans, backed by French oil company Total and the state-owned China National Offshore Corporation, with the Uganda and Tanzania government is holding minority stakes, have attracted widespread criticisms from environmentalists since it was first mooted in 2013. They claim the route endangered several national parks and it would displace tens of thousands of people from their homes. Kirikiza has been reporting on the alleged human rights abuses around the Kingfisher oil fields on the shore of Lake Albert. Oil from there will be transported along the 870-mile ECOWAS, which will run between Uganda and the Tanzania coast. Over to you, sir.
Okay, very good. All right, so first, I have a direct message, of course, to the CEO of Total Energies, Mr. Pouyanné. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's spelled, I believe, Pouyane. So, CEO of Total, this oil pipeline, and to export the oil through Uganda to Tanzania and then ship it to the international community, it's not going to work. It's not going to succeed. Look at the experience of what happened in the Delta in Nigeria. Look at the Ogoni region. Look what has happened. You are supporting a regime that is illegitimate and unpopular. And the oil pipeline runs in significant parts of areas of Uganda where the dictator, John Museveni, is very unpopular. Are you going to be able to militarily deploy to guard a pipeline hundreds of miles long?
Yeah.
Of course it won't happen. People will sabotage the pipeline because they don't like the regime. So it means they won't like any entity that is supporting the regime. So that's a direct message I'm telling you. And then in terms of how people are being brutalized, okay, it's very unfortunate, this incident of torture. And you see, now the government is denying it because obviously they know it's going to be big international news. So the question is, okay, so this guy basically tortured and self-inflicted these wounds on him that has required his hospitalization. But look at the other things that have been going on. Ordinary peasant farmers are being kicked off their land and given offers they cannot refuse. Some of them being given $20 for their land. You cannot even buy an Angus steak burger with $20 here in New York City. Somebody who's using his land to feed himself and his family and have a little money to maybe even have school fees by selling the produce from his land, and you're giving him $20 basically at the end of the battle of a gun, take it, or you're not going to get anywhere. We're still going to kick you out anyway. And they're producing documents that they allege were signed by people. Who in his right mind would sell land for $20? On the other hand, anybody with a gun pointing at his head would sign any document just to protect their lives. So this is what's going on, and I'm glad that the oil pipeline is not proceeding as the government had hoped, because many international banks, many international insurance companies have abandoned the project. So the dictatorship needs at least $2 billion and is running around the world looking for $2 billion. I mean, I know Museveni is corrupt, but I don't think he can easily pull that from wherever he's hiding his money. And why would he put down his own ill-gotten money, even if he had $2 billion somewhere, to this pipeline? So he wants others to put their money. So he's been trying lately to get the money from China. But the Chinese are not incompetent. They have representation in Uganda. They're looking at the tea leaves. They're monitoring the politics very carefully. And they're probably saying to themselves, why don't we wait it out and negotiate with Bobby Wine once he's sworn in as a president? That would be the wise thing to do. And I'm not saying that automatically Bobby Wine and his party, the National Unity Platform, would endorse the pipeline. To be honest, I don't know his position on the pipeline, given the environmental damage that's been reported, right? Is there a way that they could still accommodate it with some measures being taken to ameliorate some of the negative impact? I don't know. Personally, my own position, and this is, of course, my own personal position, is that at a stage where environmental disruption is already causing these significant damages to the ecosystem in many African countries, do we really need to be expanding the level of fossil fuels in the world? I don't know.
I mean, it's one for contemplation. I know of the issues in Ogoniland where most of the vegetation has died off. Water is hard to come by. Even the people are fishermen by trade. They now have to go further into the oceans to get fishes because the local rivers they're devoid of fishes. So again, that puts much more economic impact on the local body. Some of them have had to up sticks and move. Right. So imagine.
And the other question, of course, what about the vegetation? What about the soil that you use to grow your food? What about the water that you drink? Think about that.
What about the rain? Even the rain. The
rain. Think about that. Down. Even the rain.
Yeah,
is affected. Correct.
Is affected. So
yes, you have your version of acid rain, right?
Acid rain. Yeah. So it's a technology that needs to be let go. It's a technology that needs to be let go.
Yeah, and the thing is, we have these desperate economies with desperate leaders, and that is why they push for it at every measure. So rather than saying, let me go on a charm campaign, this is a country of young people. I'm 80 years old next year. The dictator, he turns 80 next year. Let me go on a charm campaign. What is the possible way that I can actually get the international community to finance this project? Maybe I should take example from South Africa. In the case of South Africa, of course, I oppose it because they're going in bed with imperialism. But in the case of Uganda, why not go with the youth that actually won the last election? Ease myself out. Former government of national unity. and ease myself out and say, next year I'm going to step down before the election schedule for 2 years from now. You see? Instead, you're practicing the same kind of extortion and brutality that you've been practicing for the last 38 years in power. Torturing a prominent person from an environmental organization and then having your police spokesperson saying, oh no, he's lying. He made up the wounds on his body.
He beat himself
The police, I mean, the hospital is treating fictitious wounds. It's just amazing, you know?
Again, yes. Thank you. We have come to the end of another fantastic week of news review. As usual, Brother Milton has not held back.
Thank you, comrade.
And
no, thank you. We really need to. I hope that, as I said, you know, that people use this template that we now have to produce similar lessons in every African country. Every African country, they have media outlets, right? They have podcasts, they have, but many of them are emulating the kind of news shows that they see in Europe or in the United States.
Devoid
right?
of
domestic relevance
and critical
right?
thinking.
Absolutely. Each one of them, all those outlets that now exist, whether it's radio, whether it's TV, whether it's print, have a critique that you bring your domestic talking heads once a week, whether it's Friday, whether it's Monday, and you deconstruct all these articles, all these podcasts, all these broadcasts, the way we are doing right now.
Yeah. I mean, if when we do grow this thing more, we can even offer that as a course and
absolutely
get people to come in and, you know, pay as you will, you know, that kind of thing. So that it's like I give back to the community, because I think sometimes you
struck something.
Yeah.
When you have time, you should look up some of the hosts of some of the prominent programs in these countries, whether it's Ghana, Nigeria, whether it's South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and let's get it on. Let's do one test session with them, and they will see the relevance.
Yes.
And hopefully we can spread the template, you know?
Because I think the thing about the media is it's as powerful and insidious at the same time.
Absolutely.
The point where in the hands of the wrong person, it's a terrible weapon. It's a terrible weapon, because they know force alone cannot help them. So what they do is they go for the minds. And like the great Ngugi wa Thiong'o says, you know, you have to decolonize the mind, you know.
Correct.
We just have to. We have to. And so any famous last words? And don't tell me the struggle continues.
Continua. As Comrade Samora used to say, rest in peace with the ancestors.
Yes.
But also, as the late fella used to say,
no.
The struggle must end.
Yes, I'll go with fella's last take, which is yes, the struggle must end and victory is assured. Yes. And thank you everybody for joining us. And until next week, it's good night from me. Good night.
Thank you, comrade.